This selection is from Book 3 of The Way of Thorn and Thunder, Dreyd, and it's from Chapter 2, Hauntings. When Toby opened his grit-rimmed eyes, it was still daylight, although the solitary sun moved swiftly toward an orange dusk. Waves of heat still radiated off the rolling grasslands. His only companions were a couple of mean-eyed buzzards who glared at him, as if annoyed at his rudeness for not being dead. He shared their confusion, if not their motivation. For a moment he wondered if he actually might have passed beyond the mortal world, but the burning thirst in his cracked and dusty mouth was evidence enough of life. If the old stories were true, as they so often were, the dead certainly wouldn't be thirsty. His hair was tangled and matted with dried blood. He couldn't remember the last time he'd washed it. Toby waited for a long time to move. But when there was no doubt that he wasn't dead, and that the buzzards weren't likely to go away on their own, he painstakingly pulled himself up and promptly collapsed again. After a few more false starts, he finally made it to his knees and remained there, unsteady but determined. The birds hissed and flapped away in disgust. Looking toward the west, he saw the wide stretch of dusty road and beaten grass that moved far into the horizon, but he didn't see any of the uprooted folk or the men who drove them forward. Except for a couple of buzzard-mobbed bodies lying motionless on the rough path in the distance. He was the only folk in sight. A sudden chill went up his spine. He might be alone at present, but the human and monstrous scavengers who followed behind the exiles would be along shortly. The pickings were good these days, and the men were well armed with iron and other poisons. If not for Vald's soldiers and their unknown reasons for protecting their wards from further attack, these various two-legged parasites would have decimated the folk long ago. A single crippled Tatawa would pose no problem to them, especially one weakened by thirst, hunger, and heartbreak. Still, death by oblivion was one thing. Allowing himself to be murdered was another entirely. Toby looked to the east and groaned. He could see them now, a line of figures in the far distance moving fast. They would reach him by sunset. He tried to stand, hoping to hobble into the tall grass and find a hiding place, but the pain in his injured leg was too much, and he collapsed again with a groan. His knee wouldn't possibly hold his weight. He scanned the ground for options. The grass beside the road was matted down for a long distance, but a couple of wide depressions beneath the broken vegetation caught his attention. An idea suddenly took hold of his thoughts. He might not be able to hide above the ground, but escape might be possible below it. He didn't know much about this land, but there was one thing he could recognize even in this alien place. He knew the look of Badger territory. He was, after all, born to the Badger clan, and the spirit of Buboru the Keeper, wisdom-bearer of the Tatawi clans, was in the burrow's blood. Taking a deep breath, Toby pulled himself forward on his elbows, ignoring the pain as sharp stones tore into his still tender flesh. It took longer than he expected to get to the dip in the grass. By the time he reached it, the daylight had turned crimson, stretching like a bloody stain across the prairie. The men would see him soon, and then there would be no opportunity for escape. He dug into the grass and pulled thick wads free of the hole, spreading dry brown soil across his fingers. It was as he'd hoped. An old badger burrow, long abandoned, if the musty scent was any indication. All Tatawi could feel the presence of their clan beast and close kith, and there was no such feeling here. For a moment he felt woefully alone until he realized that had a badger been in the hole, he might have had to send it fleeing into the very danger he himself was trying to avoid. Still, he realized with growing desperation it would be good to have a badger's help, as the hole was too small. He couldn't fit. His wide brown hands dug frantically at the dirt, which crumbled in his fingers and collapsed into the tunnel, filling it further with each movement he made. The heat and drought had damaged the soil and weakened the den walls. Even if it had been large enough, the burrow might well have fallen in as he tried to dig into it. Such knowledge didn't stop his digging. It was still his best choice, his only real hope. He was much too big for the hole, but if he could just open enough to drag part of his body into it, and then pull the broken grass back over his exposed body, the fading light might be enough to hide him. He had to try. Frustration burned his eyes as the dirt flew. His hands moved faster and faster, digging deeper and deeper as the soil fell again. The soft crunch of boots on dry grass nearby brought an end to the leaf speaker's efforts. He stopped digging and remained headfirst in the hole, breathing heavily, tensing for the attack. If he was going to die, he'd do it with some measure of dignity. Badger Clan was proud and defiant. He was too weak to put up much of a fight, but he'd at least draw blood before dying. His teeth bared, Toby spun around with a snarl. At first he couldn't tell what he was looking at as the blazing light of the prairie sunset burned so brightly on the figure. It wasn't until something dropped beside him that he began to comprehend. The familiar shape was battered, worn, and slightly more crumpled than it had been the last time he'd seen it, but there was no doubt about it. It was his hat. "I think you dropped this a little ways back, my brother," Tarsa said as she knelt down and pulled the leaf speaker to her. Toby trembled in disbelief for a moment, then collapsed in her arms, his body shaking with sobs of joy and relief. She gently rocked him, her fingers stroking his hair, and smoothed him like a frightened youngling awakening from a nightmare that had lasted much too long. He pulled away and looked at her, as though unable to make himself believe it, to believe that she was really there. "But Tarsa, where you been? I thought you died." She smiled. Her face was lined with sadness, but there was something new in her turquoise eyes that Toby couldn't quite understand, a strength in her arms that went beyond the tight muscles of a trained red thorn warrior. "We were separated in the great chamber of the tree. I couldn't find you. Jitani and Synovian saved us. We've been following you for weeks."